emotional speech to remit an issue back to the Alapa conference. If you haven't seen it, I would get online and have a look at it because it'll raise your spirits. And we have Professor Alf Baird. You could put your mic on, Alf. Alf is going to turn off his camera because they're way up there in Orkney, and he gets a better connection to be able to speak to us and tell us about himself and what he campaigns on. And we've got our very own Keith Brown, the man who meets up at the blether at the bar we usually have after the show. So we're going to get into a conversation. I'm going to introduce Sara to you. Sara, could you tell us a bit about yourself and what you're going to speak about tonight?
Well, to those that don't know me, I'm a former TV producer and investigative reporter, college teacher. I'm a granny. That's the biggest thing in my life is I'm a mum and a granny. And I've been working for a few years on looking at how we go around the roadblocks that have been put in front of Scotland getting her basic rights, getting what a normal country has by a British establishment that basically controls all the doors. You know, it controls the law. It's truthfully, when you look really carefully at what we're dealing with here, is we've got an elected dictatorship, and dictators don't let go. So I started with a few other people looking at what Scotland's real position was, and discovered to my astonishment that we have a written constitution, and that was protected. It was a condition of the treaty and of the union, and that under that constitution, the people can, if they have a mechanism, the people can sack the government, depending on whether it has kept the contract. So that's what I'm doing. That's the campaign.
Let's hold that for the conversation. Let's hold that. Alf,
yeah.
Professor Alf Baird, could you give us a wee introduction to yourself? Keep it short and sweet, and we'll get into the conversation proper.
Yeah, well, my background varied. I started off as a shipping clerk back in the 70s. And container shipping was about to start, and everything was going ahead. And we had various services from Leith to the continent, which had gone back, were legacy of centuries of trading connections from Scotland and the near continent, Scandinavia, Baltic, Iberian Peninsula, and Nordic Atlantic, Iceland, and so on. So I was dealing with a lot of traffic and goods for all these services. I eventually became an academic, after running my own forwarding logistics company for a while as well, because I was interested to study shipping in a global sense. And I did a PhD on shipping strategy in global container shipping with a major container shipping line, the company that started container shipping called Sea Land Service, which was run by a man called Malcolm McLean. A North Carolina truck driver who became a very innovative in shipping. But so I was interested in understanding the theoretical aspects of shipping, and I became very interested in studying and researching global trade, global shipping, and how smaller countries and former colonies became extremely successful in shipping, such as Singapore, Dubai, Hong Kong, and so many other places, Egypt as well, and Suez, Panama, so on. There's many examples, Malta, where smaller states and countries, Oman and so on, could become extremely successful. But the common theme from all of these countries and former colonies is that they had to decolonize. They had to liberate. And liberation was the only way they could fully develop, or they could develop in a serious way. And I could see that this was, to some extent, the problem Scotland faced. Scotland's ports, when I was studying ports internationally and working on collaborative EU projects with ports of Hamburg and Antwerp and Rotterdam and so on, I could easily see that Scotland was like an underdeveloped or less developed country, was like a a colonial territory. So when I retired from my job as a professor of maritime transport with Napier University back a few years ago, I developed, well, I was interested in studying this a bit more deeply, and that's what I eventually did with my book, which is called Dún Hodden, which is a book on Scotland's socio-political reality as I found it. I was interested in studying what was really the case for independence after the referendum in 2014 was lost. I was really trying to understand what independence is really about. And this drew me back to particularly the post-colonial literature. And that's how I was able to develop the theoretical framework. My background was really largely about developing theoretical frameworks in shipping and transport and business management as well, and behavioral studies, which I used to teach. And so therefore I was very interested in cultural aspects, behavioral aspects, the psychology of independence, if you like, because the psychology in management as well is always so important in organizational development, and how organizations and countries function is extremely closely related to cultural aspects. Yeah. Where language I found was also a critical aspect. So that's how I developed my framework on independence.
Excellent, Al. Thanks very much for that. We'll get into a discussion about, I believe it's Scottish maritime strategy.
Yeah.
We'll get into that. And I'll introduce our third and final guest for the evening, our very own Keith Brown. Keith, tell us a bit about yourself for the viewers.
Well, I stay in East Lothian in a East Coast town called Dunbar. I worked on a fishing boat when I was 19-year-old.
Connection.
For 3.5 years. I was a member of the offshore lifeboat crew as well. I've worked in electronics in Haddington, building TVs for 7.5 years. I've also worked in the building trade. I'm a City and Guilds joiner.
And you're also an indie activist and a sovereign Scot.
Yep. Born a sovereign Scot and I'll die a sovereign Scot. Well,
you can't forego it. Just before we go any further, I've got a few viewers on. I'm just going to say hello to Kevin Campervan Man Rolink, Anita King. Anita, we didn't give the notification out tonight because we were running behind, and we thought we'll get into the show right away. So apologies for that. We've got Stuart Cram and Eileen Manson, William Forbes, regular, Dave Llewellyn, good evening, freedom fighters. Ellen Newman, hello from Falkirk, home of the Salvo launch. We have the great silent Klansman, he's not saying much tonight, and Joe Gibson. Oof, get in there, Keith. So guys, please feel free to join in the conversation. If you've got a question, I'll do my best to put it to the panel. But let's get into the first topic. The first topic is, for me, especially for me, Sarah, what does Salvo mean?
The name comes from an old Scottish constitutional provision. It was where the Scottish Parliament, Scottish government really, because it was the Crown in Parliament, it still is, by the way, government is Crown in Parliament, acknowledged that the people were sovereign by offering salvo at the end of every parliamentary session. And that was, it comes from salvo jure cuius libet, let whoever, Willie McRae translates it as let whoever sue the Crown. It's used today to mean saving the rights of anybody. And what it meant was that you could go into the group or an individual could go into the Parliament and claim salvo at the end of the parliamentary session. What that meant was, I'm claiming rights that you're taking. I've got the right here. And then if there was, as I understand it, because our records are very badly kind of corrupted, missing. There's lots of bits missing. But my understanding is that then what happened was, if there was a dispute, that Parliament didn't have the right to do something because it violated the contract with people, it took away rights that the people had, then that would be referred to the Court of Session to be decided. So this was a real acknowledgement that Parliament had to defer to the people. So the one piece of writing by William McCrae that you can find online, and it's somewhere in Electronic Scotland, he gives this piece where he explains that this is the acknowledgement of the sovereignty of the people, which is contained in each one of us and all of us collectively, where the Parliament acknowledges that the people are sovereign. And he gives this very moving story about it. He says the last time that Salvo was offered was the very last parliamentary session, when they signed that forced Treaty of Union. But you know, we all know about the stories how the doors were barred. They had to go down into the cellars. The people were rioting on the streets. So
This
nobody could get.
This was the parliamentarians.
Aye, you remember, you know, the story when the Treaty of Union was actually signed and the people in Edinburgh knew what was going on. In fact, it was all over Scotland there were riots, but the Parliament couldn't sit because of the riots. So they had to go into this basement, I'm told, as I understand it, and bar the doors, lock themselves in to sign this treaty. Or they had been strung up, you know?
Yeah.
So he says they still did it. He said, I don't know how he knew that, and I'd love to find out, but he says they still, even though nobody could get in, they still had to offer Salvo, because in 1663 it had been made a law. It was an act was passed. They had to do this.
So that law, can I ask again, that law has never been repealed?
You know, it's very difficult to find out. So far as I know, it hasn't, but there are a whole lot of Scottish laws that were repealed by Westminster in 1912 and then again in 1920. And if you look on the site, the Records of the Parliament of Scotland, it will actually say we can't find out all of the Scottish laws that they repealed. There's absolutely no right to do that, but they did. So far as I know, it's still there, but it applied to the Scottish Parliament. And the Scottish Parliament and the English Parliament were dissolved. And so we can't apply it to Westminster, but what it still stands for, that the people are sovereign. So, you know, that's why we took the name. Right.
Keith, you've done a bit of research on this whole issue, have you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if there is no record of it ever being repealed, is it still live?
Yeah, well, if the Treaty of Union, which is still live, right, everything written in it as the preconditions is still live. So therefore, in my eyes, the claim of right and our written constitution is still live and relevant to this day.
It is.
So if it's still live and relevant, and they have got rid of any records, then in a court of law, I'm being a backstreet lawyer here, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. In a court of law, if there's no evidence to be presented, then there's no argument against it still being live.
Well, what the courts say today is that if it's gone into disuse, then it's not live. And because we don't have, see, the Scottish Parliament isn't the Scottish Parliament, it's the Scottish Executive of Westminster. So we don't have our Parliament back. If we did get our Parliament back, when we do, forgive me for swearing, using the F word, when we get our Parliament back, I think there's a very strong case to be made for the fact that we get our laws back with it and Salvo comes right back. And can you imagine people having the right to go in and say, here's our written constitution, which, by the way, is still law. Lord Cullen referred to it. Roddy Dunlop acknowledged it's still law. It is still there. It is still live. It's it's part of what wonderful Professor Sir Neil McCormick called the Scottish anomaly, that in Scotland the people are sovereign, in Westminster the Parliament is sovereign. It's never been resolved.
Oxymoron.
Well, it's an anomaly. You can't have both, and they knew that at the time, you know. But what Westminster's doing now is it's under Section 38 of the EU Withdrawal Bill. It's imposing by law parliamentary sovereignty across the UK, and it's got a nice brand new Act of Union waiting in the wings.
Yes.
Whether Scotland wants it or not. So
I'm going to bring Keith Alf in for a view on what's been discussed so far. Alf.
Yeah, well, I think the Salvo initiative led by Sara has been extremely important. The Constitution of Scotland has been that. If that was a condition of the treaty, then it's still a condition of the treaty, because the Scottish people have never been asked to to alter that. And what Westminster might have done could obviously be argued against, that it wasn't lawful to do that, to change anything in the Treaty of Union without the permission and approval of the Scottish people. But the fact of the matter is that constitution, the Scottish Constitution, if you like, I think it was lost in Article 25 of the treaty, but lost for quite some time, and it's only suddenly raised its head because of people such as Sara who have uncovered all of this. So if that's still a condition of the treaty, then that's an important aspect. It's not the only aspect, however. I believe that that certainly a sovereign people have a right to withdraw from a treaty that's no longer in their interest anyway. So we have that right. We also have the right of self-determination under the UN Declaration. Yeah. We particularly have the right to self-determination where we are an oppressed people. And this was also found in the case in this Canadian Supreme Court decision with regard to Quebec, in that Quebec wasn't necessarily regarded as an oppressed people. There they had their language, the French language. You also had a French-speaking elite. The problem we have in Scotland is we are deprived of our language. We are therefore, our elite is not necessarily Scots-speaking. Our elite is largely Anglophone. And that is the cultural hegemony imposed on Scotland in what Professor Michael Hechter called the internal colonialism model of the UK, where you had the core England and the Celtic periphery. And that led to a cultural division of labour and the exploitation of the peripheral nations, whose economies, and I go back to my shipping background here in trade, whose economies are simply plundered and there to support the core nation. So Scotland has been oppressed. We've lost our assets and resources. We don't have full exploitation of them. Our people are underdeveloped, and millions, 3 to 4 million Scots were, in colonialism terms, banished as natives. So this outmigration was one of the biggest outmigrations for a country of Scotland's size in Europe. And that's an enormous outmigration. And this was incentivized as well as forced migration. So it was incentivized, it was basically planned. So what you have is the mass outmigration of a native population, and then their gradual replacement by a cultural hegemony, which is Anglophone and Unionist. So we have this, we have language deprivation, we have our economy plundered, we don't have access to resources, our nation is underdeveloped, our people are underdeveloped, and that is the rationale for independence. Because what I find in studying colonialism or post-colonial theory is that peoples that want independence are largely dependent on the solidarity of an ethnic group. And the reason that ethnic group is so important is because that is the ethnic group that's oppressed. And we get this oppression particularly through cultural and linguistic mechanisms. The Scots language isn't taught to bairns in school. We ken that. That is the big omission. And this is important because what I found in my research post the referendum was that the two fundamentals of a people's identity are their culture and their language. And these are the dimensions, these are the things that give us our national consciousness.
Right.
So, although, yeah.
So we have a question from Ellie Just Ellie. Now, I probably know the answer to this. I wonder what would happen if someone shouted salvo in Holyrood. Now, Sarah, would
Probably be a few heart attacks, I think.
the Parliament be duty bound to discuss said salvo?
I wish. I think it's back to two things. One, we are in what's called an incorporating union. Now, it's really, really important to understand that what that meant was that actually meant at the time, both the English Parliament and the Scottish Parliament went, they dissolved themselves or went into abeyance and were replaced by a new entity, and they were both incorporated into that, right? Since then, the English side of the constitutional con artists, or whatever you want to call them, have argued that that actually meant that England remained and Scotland was incorporated in. Now they've tried to make that argument several times, and they've been knocked back by pretty amazing Scottish constitutional lawyers. The most famous of whom is the late Professor David Walker. And then Ian Campbell followed up on that. Professor Ian Campbell followed up on that. There's just no question. Once you read their work, this is another con trick. But that means that even taken what happened under the treaty, the two separate parliaments no longer existed, and they came together in a new one. The question of whether provisions that maintained Scotland's constitutional arrangement, where the Parliament was answerable to the people, have been hidden. I mean, they've just been glossed over, and it would take me ages to explain how it was done, and how the courts came round to, it's the English Constitution, Scotland was incorporated. It's all bogus. In any international court would throw this out. Okay, we've just never had the opportunity to take that, to have it reviewed internationally under treaty conditions, under the conditions of the Constitution of Nations, the provisions for those. That has never been done. My feeling is that in if it were fairly done, Scotland's constitution was protected. It is a written constitution. It's what the claim of right did was it didn't create a constitution. It didn't, unlike the English Bill of Rights. What it did was it summarised an existing Scottish constitution, which you can back up by going through the records of the Parliaments of Scotland and looking at the statutes and provisions that went into place from 1310 up to 1689, and you will see that the claim of right is actually, it's a very learned document, because they're well aware of these constitutional provisions and they're setting them out. They're not inventing them. Then that is protected. That constitution is protected as a condition of the treaty and the union. Now you've got an international treaty, and you've got a condition, a precondition, which I call a prenup, because it was a forced marriage. There was a prenup, which we have to thank our ancestors for putting in place. And that prenup was, this condition applies, that the union continues, the treaty goes ahead, as long as these statutes, the most important of which is named as the claim of right, continue in Scotland. Now,
Right.
under that, that would mean that all our constitutional provisions, not just what's explicitly set out in the claim of right, but everything that upholds the sovereignty of the Scottish people, remains in place. And one of those things was salvo. So strictly speaking, yes, not Holyrood, Westminster. We should be able to go into Westminster and shout salvo.
So, Keith, on that basis, we spoke a couple of weeks back, and you were telling me much of the same thing.
Yeah.
What have you learned? And just to answer Kevin Ralei, how do we ascertain what the sovereign people of Scotland actually want without a vote of some kind? So if you, in layman's terms, the rules are still in place, and as Sarah says, we can walk into, or we should be able to, barring terrorism laws and the more laws that are coming down the line in the new bill that's getting introduced, we should be able to walk into Westminster and declare salvo and ascertain our rights. That's my thinking. Our rights to hold that referendum. Could we do it on that basis?
Well, the thing is, you're dealing with what I've sussed out in my own head is that the treaty union was two separate countries, independent countries, right, that entered the treaty. Now, history, it was a stitch-up, right? Before, during and after. The signing in the cellar off the Royal Mile, where the plaque is, downstairs, it's there. I've seen it, right? It was a whole setup. It was a stitch-up. And I think that part of the reason why they done it was that they've seen the way Scotland's democracy was run and implemented, and how the people had power over the Parliament and be it a king or a queen if you had one, right? So they seen us as a threat to the way they ruled, right? So what better way to get rid of that threat to the way you rule, to stitch them up, get them into this treaty, right? And then through 315 years, we'll strip their rights away from them, their language, everything. And now, in the 60s, the United Nations brought out the decolonisation charter, right? And they went to Westminster, and Westminster practically shot a brick, right? I thought, oh, what do we do here? They find out about this treaty union and that. So, well, we'll just tell them it's voluntary and Scotland can leave at any time they want and everything. So they actually lied to the United Nations.
Nothing new there then.
Yeah, so that just shows you that they think that they own us and we're a colony, the same as Wales and Northern Ireland are, right? And we're being treated as such as well.
Well, that brings it in then to Al's description of internal colonisation. We are the last bastion of the empire, the Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland.
I would say we were the first. I would actually say we were the first.
First and last.
Yeah, the first. We were the first to become a colony through the Treaty Union, right? Because it was a stitch-up, right?
Yep.
Now we're trying to leave, and we've been denied our rights as a colony. Right? If you look at the 5 wannabe prime ministers that sat up on Channel 4 for all to see, and every single one of them denied Scotland its rights.
Or will deny if given the opportunity.
Yeah.
They've not been given the opportunity yet. Right, I'm going to bring this part of the conversation to a close. So, Sarah, I noticed you were writing something there. Is there something you want to add?
It was just the answer to the question about, yeah, absolutely. For things to have democratic force, you have to have votes. But what I wanted to point out is this. That constitution was protected, and that constitution makes provision for what happens if a government imposes autocratic, tyrannical and despotic rule over Scotland, including claiming to have absolute authority. That is sovereignty. Westminster is claiming sovereignty. That is unlawful under the Scottish Constitution. There are also a series of rights that are protected as part of the compact. They have violated those. And by the way, Holyrood has violated a few as well. And the penalty for that under the Scottish Constitution is forfeiture of power. The government ceases to be legitimate. Now, we don't have a mechanism anymore, but it would not be difficult to put it back, particularly if we could get international recognition that we have an international treaty which has a condition. The condition is clear. Do we have the right to this constitution back? Yes, we do. So we put back this tribunal. It's not something that requires a franchise because it's not making laws. It's ruling on the law. It's not making policy to affect people's lives. It's applying the policy that exists already. It's looking like you would hear a case has, you know, your honor, so-and-so burgled the house on this date. Here's the evidence. Innocent or guilty. It's exactly the same. You want a decent tribunal, as representative as possible. When that is convened and the Constitution of Scotland is applied and the law is applied, the result is the forfeiture of power. Now, at that point, you would then say to the people of Scotland, here are the routes we can take. Here is what's available in terms of redress. What do you want to do?
How then do we get that message and that information out to the people?
Well, a certain Mr. Alex Salmon has put it fairly simply. We need a mass civic movement. We need everybody to realize. And by the way, this is part of decolonization, because when people see and hear what the Constitution says, the reaction is, I get that. You know it here. We've always been that way. It's always been we're all Jack Thompson's bairns. It's always been a man's a man for all that. The sense that, you know, and that's the old Celtic idea. It's not a greasy pole with someone that matters at the top and someone that doesn't at the bottom. Mm-hmm. It's all of us together. That's Celtic, and it's where the Scottish Constitution comes from. So we're both reclaiming rights, creating the movement for that political change that will bring the law back, but we're also getting our own identity back, who we are. We've been robbed of for such a long time. So that's the big part, is to get this out, to get people to remember, this is who we are, guys. This is us. This is Scotland. This is why we're so fierce about this, because we're not England. And then we've got the other two parts, which are to get a body that is, I mean, the Scottish government could do it now. They could go to the International Court of Justice and say, hey, guys, have we got an international treaty or not? No matter what these shysters say. And the answer is clear. We have an international treaty, no matter what they say, how they try to say it's not a treaty. It is. Does it have a condition? Yes, it does. Do we get to put our condition back and the international community will recognize that? Yes, of course. So they could do that. But if they want, we need to create an organization that fulfills the requirements, which Alf can talk about actually, for recognition sufficient to bring that to the International Court of Justice, to ask for a ruling on not on whether we're independent, but on whether we've got an international treaty that has to be observed.
Yeah.
That means that you've then got recognition for this convention, this tribunal to go ahead. And that means that when the tribunal says we have to have a national referendum to decide what people want to do, it's already got international recognition. So, you know, in that way, we can actually go around our politicians. And if we're successful, and I think there's a very good chance that we can be, we end up with a politically very different Scotland. We get rid of elected dictatorship. We get the common good back at the heart of government, and we get a government that is accountable, directly accountable to the people, not just who don't have to go cap in hand and beg for human rights and basic justice. So it's win-win. We get our independence, but we also get the kind of Scotland that we deserve.
Excellent. Alf, very quickly, anything you want to add to conclude this part of the conversation?
Well, my main research in this area has pushed me into the post-colonial theory, I have to say. And we're in that reality. And we have to remember that the UN defines independence as pretty much decolonization. Now, are we seriously saying that Scotland is any different from the 60 other colonies that have left London rule? I don't think so, because the UN also regarded Ireland as a former colony. Now, we are in that is the reality. And let's also remember that most or many colonies also had a treaty, and the treaties were violated no end. and the colony's history was always eradicated. The culture was eradicated. The language was destroyed. It's what's known in post-colonialism as cultural obliteration. And that is aligned with, at the same time, cultural assimilation. Now, we see cultural assimilation in basically making Scots bairns Anglophones, if you like. So from their early school days, all they're taught is yin language, and that's it. And they're not taught their Scots language or Gaelic if that's their mother tongue. But Scots, as Billy Kay would say, is our mother tongue.
Yeah.
And there's a good reason why we don't get taught that language, because that is what gives us our national consciousness, our national identity, our desire for nationhood is fundamental. So what we have is a rusted tongue. We can't write in it, we can't read in it, but we can speak it as best we can. It's rusted, it's not quite as good as it would be, but you know, when people become independent, that is the first thing they grab, is their mother tongue. Because it's the only thing that gives them distinctiveness. So however we get our liberation, and that is what decolonization is, liberation from oppression. However we manage to do that, whether it's through claim of right, the Constitution, the treaty, the UN decolonization, or however, UDI as well. However we do that, the first thing we grab is our culture and our language, because these are the only things that give us our national identity, our national consciousness. And that is what also gives internationalism, if you like. We can't become international until we're first national. And the nations of the world are what gives internationalism. It's the empires that destroy national identities. It's the empires that destroy national cultures. And that's what the UN created the self-determination process for, was to remove empire bullying and the bully languages and the bully culture and the bullies and those that plundered other nations, took all the resources and destroyed the cultures. And this, if anything, even going back to the Roman times, Roman imperialism, we know that nationalisms and national peoples and countries, these were the bulwark against empire destruction. Whoever is the empire, it doesn't really matter whether it's Britain, Russia, France, whoever, China, America, we have a certain amount of bully powers. So that's the reality. So I think, basically what I would say is two things. The people's understanding of independence is rudimentary. And this is where their understanding has to be improved. So the role of Salvo, the role of SSRG, and the role of the indie bloggers, and such as yourself as well as these programs, extremely important in widening understanding of what independence is. And it's not just about different government. It's not just about that. It's fundamentally different. And the other thing, just to end on, is that the politicians have let us down stinking. But that is normal in decolonization. The dominant national party always seeks a cooperation with the imperial power. And that's what we have. And these politicians are not nationalists as we see, with the exception of Kenny McCaskill and Neil Handy last week. They were demonstrating nationalism in that sense, the liberation of the people as being important. The other groups that we have representing us don't really know what nationalism is, what independence is, what the claim of right is, what the Constitution is, and they demonstrate it every day sitting down in Westminster.
I would agree in all of that. Kenny McCaskill and Neil Handy walking out. Now, I think there was something when Speaker Hoyle, Hoyle commanded the sergeants armed to remove, and then said, "No, just see them out." There was something in the changing of that word, that wording, that didn't break the Treaty of the Union, because if they're forcibly removed, this is just me, layman's thinking. If they're forcibly removed, then there's a price to pay for that. It was quite a deliberate act. He'd spoken to them to be removed, and then said, "Follow them out." So that, watch that. But anyway, on closing this part of the conversation, because I could spend a few hours speaking with you guys. It's building up a bit of motivation again. I've been away from the scene for quite some time, and I'm, as I said earlier, Sarah, I'm getting back on the horse. I'm ready to join in again, and I hope many others of the independence movement are ready to join in again, because this year coming, whether Westminster likes it or not, we're having our referendum, or we're going to have something else in place. But Dave Llewellyn has just messaged earlier, we will have our chance to test whether the claim of right is active at 10 a.m. on August the 2nd at Edinburgh Sheriff Court. So maybe Dave can expand on that, and we can get a wee turnout at the Edinburgh Sheriff Court on the 2nd of August at 10 a.m. Right, Alf.
Yeah.
We've taken up most of the programme on Salvo, and I would like to take it up again in the future, Sarah. But I would put a call out to the yes groups. We all need to, I'm being educated here tonight. We all need to be educated on what our powers are. We don't know what they are. I didn't know half of what I've been told tonight. So I would call on the yes groups to contact salvo.scot, is it?
Yep.
Or contact the People's Doorstep Referendum, the People's International Chat Show, contact myself. I'll get educated on it, and we'll come and speak to you. I need to know.
Look forward to it.
I need to know what powers we have and what powers we can enact. That is the key. We don't have to wait on politicians doing it for us.
No.
We can get up on our feet and let the politicians know we're going to do it for ourselves.
Yeah.
So I'm going to close this subject down, but I want to bring it back at a later date. Alf.
Yep.
The Scottish maritime strategy.
Yes.
You've given us a bit to your background and what you've went into academia.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us what the Scottish maritime strategy is or could be.
Yeah. Well, at the moment, there's no maritime strategy. There's no maritime policy. Within the UK civil service that runs Scottish departments, including Transport Scotland, there's no focus on developing Scotland's maritime capability, if you like. And my research, as I mentioned, was more international. So I was able to come back and look at Scotland and have a good laugh to myself. But I was also a ship agent in Leith back in the 70s. And even then we were calling for infrastructure investment to handle cruise ships, to handle ferries, to handle the next generation of ships, container ships and so on. And it all fell on deaf ears. So we were left with Victorian infrastructure. And I'm talking about the 1970s and 80s. We were left with Victorian infrastructure. And that's what we still have, is Victorian infrastructure. So in that time, in the last 50 years, 60 years, shipping globally has completely transformed, as we know, as supply chains have changed, as countries' competitiveness has improved. The key thing is, without modern, sophisticated ports, an economy can't compete. It cannot exist as it should do. It cannot sustain any kind of competitive advantage. And this is partly our relationship with UK, with England's supply chain, if you like. Scotland is locked into England's supply chain. So we're dependent mainly on ports in the south of England. We're dependent on logistics centres in central England. And we're dependent largely on road transport and rail to some extent. And we've not, our economy is largely, as I said, through the internal colonialism model. It's about supplying England, and it's about being supplied by England. And that's what we have. So our Victorian ports are a legacy of that. In addition to that, during the Thatcher period, when Malcolm Rifkind was Transport Minister, he sold off Scotland's major estuarial ports. So the Forth, the Clyde and the Tay were sold off, and they're now owned by offshore private equity groups. the same as our airports are owned by offshore private equity groups, the same as our energy companies, most of our whiskey companies, most of our landed estates. Most of Scotland is owned by offshore equity outfits. And what these organizations do is they acquire the assets, they dump a lot of debt on them because that's a leveraged transaction. They never have any money to invest in new infrastructure. So we don't see new infrastructure because of the privatization model adopted by Thatcherism, which also led to private regulation of our estuaries. So these offshore private equity groups don't just own and operate the ports on the Forth, Clyde and Tay, they also regulate them. So we have private regulators. But as I say, the model is dysfunctional. On my continental colleagues in academia call it the Anglo-Saxon model of port privatization. But essentially, the Anglo-Saxon model of financial mismanagement covers all of Scotland's assets, or most of them. Everything from universities as well and private schools. So the whole system is dysfunctional, and it leads to inequality, oppression. The Scots don't have access to the resources. We don't develop our capability. We don't have any European ferry connection, for example, whereas Ireland has about a dozen, and Norway as well, and Estonia and Sweden and Finland. They also, and even Faroe Islands has ferry connections to the continent that we don't have. Iceland as well. So Scotland is, as I say, it's underdeveloped as an internal colony or a colony. Its focus is largely on supplying the mother country, and its assets are taken out cheap and resources sold back dear. And this is how colonialism works. We sell our assets cheap, whether it's oil and gas, renewable energy, whiskey, aggregates, anything. We sell it cheap because we don't control it, and we buy it back dear.
Yeah. So the question is, does this maritime strategy infrastructure have to be in place before independence? Or are we able to put it in place?
Well, I've been arguing for some years now and working with Preston Pans Community Council to try and develop a cruise ferry terminal at Cockenzie. That's the old power station.
Yeah.
I first done studies of that back in the 90s for Scottish Power, and with also the Leith Harbour Master, Captain Landos. And we found that that was the best location for a new cruise and ferry terminal for Scotland to serve the European market. It's close to the open sea, it's near the bypass, it's rail connected, and it's ideal also for inland navigation, barges up to Grangemouth, across to Methil, all the rest of it. So it could be a very nice, as the Europeans call it, a trimodal terminal. Now, the council own that port, and I'm having a long-standing battle with them at the moment to try and develop it as a cruise ferry terminal. Forth Ports, who own the rest of the ports in the Forth and regulate it, they're owned by the offshore equity financial engineers, and they don't want any competition on the river. So we're in a difficult. It's in that kind of situation. East Lothian Council don't have a clue about maritime transport, so they don't understand it. The Scottish government has no maritime policy, so they're not interested. And the UK civil servants talk about the same UK policy in London, which is to put all the freight down to England's south coast ports, Felixstowe, Dover, Liverpool, whatever. But it's not to develop Scottish ports, and they won't intervene in the market. The Scottish government civil servants won't intervene, even although the market's failed Scotland. And we don't have a ferry connection to the continent. We don't have a cruise port that in the Forth, the capital region, that it can't handle the biggest cruise ships. They all anchor offshore at Hound Point or off New Haven, and everybody's got to be tendered ashore, which is like a third world.
Or they've got to anchor at Greenock.
Yeah, well, yeah, they go to Greenock as well. But essentially on the Forth, there's nothing for them. And that was the same in the 1970s when I was a shipping clerk and ship agent. We were struggling then. So think about it now. We're struggling now. We need this port. It's not a very big port. The people where I am in Orkney, we developed here when I was in the Harbours Department as an academic advisor, we developed one of the best cruise and ferry terminals in Scotland, probably the best one. It's in Kirkwall, and it can handle the biggest cruise ships in the world. Now, Kirkwall Orkney handles more cruise ships than Edinburgh.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it handles ferries every day, coming in
Right.
and going out. So this is what Cookenzie could do.
Let me get a view from Keith. Keith, what's
Yeah,
your view on what's not taking place in Scottish Maritime?
well, well, the fishing industry is totally knackered with Brexit, that's for sure. All the local fishermen that I know in the town where I live, but there's plenty coastal tankers I see running up and down the Forth going to Grangemouth to get filled up. Okay, and so the Cookenzie thing, I can remember that was mentioned, but across in Rosyth, they started a container ship port. Right, so that's up and running now. Because I see every 2 days there's container ships going up the Forth.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where they're
But
getting
not
off.
to the extent is required for a national infrastructure.
Nah, the problem is we don't own our own ports, because every single thing that should belong to the sovereign people of Scotland in this country has been stripped from us by the government next door.
And it always
Yeah,
will. It'll continue until we take the decision that we're going to impose independence on Westminster.
Yeah.
It's not a matter of the imposing it on the people. We'll get the authority
Well,
of the people.
Pat, the day that I sat and I watched the Scottish Parliament open is the day that I had my eyes open to what it's like to be in a colony.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because they all stood there and they swore allegiance to another country's queen and said they swear an allegiance to the sovereign people of Scotland.
Bar one.
Aye.
Bar one. That man was Tommy Sheridan. Tommy Sheridan
Yeah.
refused to swear allegiance directly to the Queen.
Yeah.
But we had such a conversation on the Salvo discussion, and Alf, you contributed to it greatly. Is there anything else you want to put to the viewers on maritime issues that Scotland needs to address?
Yeah, just to finish off, Roy Peterson, who was head of Highlands and Islands Transport and a councillor for the SNP, head of transport in Inverness for the Highlands, he and I put together a Scottish maritime policy report for the SNP Westminster group. And that was, they commissioned us to do that. That report was also passed by the SNP National Conference in 2019 to be policy of the party, to be implemented. It's never been implemented. It was put on a shelf by civil servants. So it's never been implemented. That would have covered new policies on ferries, on container shipping, on other forms of transport, on port infrastructure, on shipbuilding, and a whole range of other aspects, maritime regulation. It would have also created a Scottish Maritime Authority to develop these policies and to put in place these aspects, because by this time we should have had our Brexit bypass. The ferry connections to the continent should have been developed. We should have daily connections or more. Ireland's got at least a dozen of them bypassing the UK. We should have had them the same, but they've not been implemented by the civil servants in Edinburgh or the SNP. They've let us down. They've had that policy for a long time. There's a lot of things in it that could have been done. And they've got the powers to do a lot of these things just now, but they refuse to do that. They could have prepared the ground for independence. And remember, if and when Scotland becomes independent, it can't depend on England's ports.
Yes.
We cannot depend on England's ports anymore. We have to develop our own system to the continent. So if the SNP were serious about independence, they would prioritise today ports on the Forth and direct ferry connections. They could even have CalMac running them if they wanted to. We could do all that. We could charter the boats, as they've chartered a ferry recently for Ukrainian refugees sitting in Glasgow. They can charter a ship tomorrow. I can charter a ship tomorrow. I used to charter ships. Anybody can charter ships, you know, but we could do this tomorrow if it was government. Government has to do it.
But there has to be a plan in place. And if they haven't adopted the policy,
there is a plan. We can give them the plan.
Yes,
give them the template, but they've shown no commitment to do it.
That's exactly what I'm saying, Alf. If they haven't adopted the policy and put it in place, then they're going to have to revisit it. So the question is, why have the government not put a strategy, at least an idea?
Well, my answer to that is we have a parliament in Edinburgh. We have a so-called government in Scotland, but it's really just a colonial administration. That is what it is.
So it has to change, and it has to change soon. We have to
be friendly, and the people in it has to change as well.
Yes.
The people in it have to have allegiance to Scotland, no to another power.
And salvo has to be used at some point.
Well, salvo is also about allegiance to a nation and the constitution, and where the common good of the people is being undermined, and we have a despotic power that's betraying the people, and that's where we are. You can't serve 12 maesters.
No,
you know,
some can.
At the moment,
some can.
That's what the government in Edinburgh try to do. They're trying to serve 12 maesters, and you can't do it because you love one and loathe the other.
Yes, right, folks. Well, I'm gonna just close off with a wee statement from Owen Hay. Guys, this is music to my ears, and lots of us knew everyone involved in this project to open the blinds have been fantastic. Our way forward, at long last, it's absolutely clear as day. Scotland forever, just brilliant. Thanks to everyone involved. That's an endorsement if ever I heard one. So my thanks to Sara Salyers. My thanks to Keith Brown and Alf. Thank you very much for your contribution. I would love to see both of you back on the show so that we can go further in depth. But I'm gonna put a call out to the yes groups, the grassroots yes groups. We need to discuss this in depth before the end of this year, before the end of a year. Because if we give ourselves from now until next July, we'll be in a place when the campaign really needs to be ramped up to inform the public what we're being denied of. So we're going to have a blether at the bar, I believe. The link will go up in the next few minutes. It's been a pleasure, Alf, meeting you. I hope to speak to you much more in the future. And Keith, it's always a pleasure.
Thanks very much.
It's always a pleasure.
Pleasure to speak to you.
So until we meet again, give us your last thoughts. Where should, in a wee 30-second slot, what should we do next, Alf?
I think everybody should go to Dunfermline at the end of the month for the SSRG conference, because that conference will lay a lot of this out, and a lot of what Sara was talking about with Salvo. And that's the 29th, 30th, 31st. And people can just go for a day if they want. They didn't have to do the 3 days. And that's organised by Mark McNaught and the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group. And that'll have a lot of interesting speakers, myself included.
Well, if you could get Mark to link it to our page and send us each a link, we'll get it shared. Another thing, what we done during the referendum really well was we shared everybody's message. We need to get back to doing that. Keith, last words, last thoughts.
Oh, last thoughts. Well, as far as I'm concerned, what we've got is a colonial administration. And like say at the last local council elections, I spoke to a local SNP councillor that's now sitting in Holyrood. And when I mentioned about the claim of right in the written constitution, it was part of the preconditions of the Treaty of Union. Oh, you've been listening to Alba, I didn't listen to them and listen to that nonsense.
Well,
Yeah.
that was stated earlier on that there are many.
I mean, so
Sorry, Keith, for interrupting, but there are many within Westminster and Holyrood, representing Scottish interests that don't know the facts.
Yeah,
or
well,
would
the thing is to actually dismiss your own nation's constitutional paperwork and everything is irrelevant, really?
No.
No.
There's my point. We need to educate not just ourselves, but our politicians.
Well, I think the politicians, a lot of them know it, but they're just in denial of it.
No, I would actually argue that they don't actually know it. They don't actually know it. I was a councillor with the SNP activists in the SNP for a number of years, and this is the first I'm hearing of it.
Well, but I think it's odd, isn't it? It's either they've been told, oh, it's so irrelevant, it's old, and it can blah blah blah. So they've been maybe hoodwinked as well.
In my view, it's 20th century politics. You take the party line.
That's it.
You take the party line. And I beg the question, if you guys can dig this information up, then why have the hierarchy in the movement? The hierarchy in the movement no dug it up before you.
Exactly.
But we'll leave it there. Don't want to cause divide, but we have the opportunity to educate even further. And I think it's massively important that we, as a movement, know exactly what our rights are and devise a way of enacting those rights. Because in the claim of right and the Declaration of Arbroath, we are the sovereign people. And if we are the sovereign people, then we must have the right and the duty to enact that sovereignty. So I hope you've enjoyed our conversation tonight. I hope more of our listeners and viewers get involved with Salvo and join the SSRG, Scottish Sovereignty
Research
Group. But I hope we all now actively pursue informing ourselves of what is there and what can be used, and we go and do it. So my thanks again to you all, Alf, Keith, and Sarah. Sarah had to leave because our wee dog required some insulin. So it was an absolute pleasure meeting both of you, and I know it's a pleasure speaking to you, Keith. And Raymond in the background. Holding the show together. Thanks very much. And thanks for asking me to host tonight, Raymond. It's been a pleasure. Good night, one and all, and we'll see you next week.